Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Everyone, this is Colin once again. Just got back from a long drive, was celebrating Thanksgiving, but felt inspired to do this video. This video is being done because a user or subscriber of mine here on YouTube asked if I would do this video. He asked that if I hadn't already done a video talking about what got me into Swedenborgianism, could I do that? I think I've touched on this perhaps in some recent videos, maybe some blog posts, but I have not done a video where at least I don't think so, where I talked about this in detail. So if I have done this, I apologize, but I don't think I have. I think I've mentioned it, maybe abstractly, maybe some minor details, but not like the full-fledged story. So I'm going to do that in this video, and since I always forget to say this in my most recent videos, if please follow me on Twitter, subscribe to my blog on WordPress, Dreaming in Symbols. I'm going to be writing more blog posts in the near future. I am not terribly consistent on Twitter, but I am trying to change that. So if you want to follow me on those things, I'd greatly appreciate it. And you can see the links to those things on my main page. So, yeah, Swedenborgianism. Let me take you back. So yeah, I really didn't do a video until recently where I was like, hey, I'm not a Muslim anymore. Of course, I did post on my blog, basically a very simplistic version, cutting to the chase, of why I left Islam. But yeah, I just started talking about this guy Swedenborg, and I see where some of you might have been like, whoa, wait a minute. Sweden what? And so yeah, I'm glad that someone asked for me to do this video. So it was back in 2012, and I was making videos. I'm sure if you've been watching me for any amount of years now. Back in 2012, I was pretty much on my way out of Islam. As many of you saw, I was sort of jumping around different types of Islam. I certainly didn't consider myself a Sunni any longer, and I was looking at Sufism. I was looking at the Muslim philosophers, the Mu'taziliya. I was looking at Ibn Rushd, Ibn Hazm, and Ibn Arabi. And that's sort of where I landed after a while. I landed at these three people in particular, Ibn Hazm, Ibn Arabi, and Ibn Rushd, in terms of my understanding of Islam. And I was just reading and reading and reading, and really enjoying reading about these three individuals and their approach to Islam. And even though it was intellectually fascinating for me to do that, it was sort of, it dawned on me pretty much in early 2012, well, there's, most Muslims here in the United States don't, there's no, mosque or group that really follows that perspective, what might be considered to be a Cordoban, I don't even know. Just basically, I'm in the wrong time period. And, that would have been great if I had been, born back then, or maybe not. But the fact is that it would be very difficult to practice Islam, from such a minority position, like a minority of one, and so that was the sense of it was the lack of community. I had stopped going to mosque. I don't even know when the last time was. And I was growing disillusioned with Islam, and certainly had been disillusioned with Orthodox Islam, traditional Orthodox Islam, Sunni Islam, and was basically, kicking and screaming all the way to the exit. And so around mid-2012, actually, it was my mother. My mother had been reading Swedenborg when I was a Muslim. I'm not sure how long she was reading Swedenborg. I feel like the name came up several times, and she would encourage me to read this guy Swedenborg, and I shrugged it off. I mean, my mind was totally in Islam. I was not interested in reading about some 18th century Christian mystic. It just didn't interest me at the time. And so, I was just like, yeah, okay, whatever, But when I was on my way out of Islam in 2012, I started to have more of an open mind towards reading other things. And so I picked up this book here. And by the way, all the books I'm about to pick up, I would highly recommend. This is the first book I read, Swedenborg and Esoteric Islam by Henry Corbin. And I had read Henry Corbin before. I had read his works on Ibn Arabi in particular. And I read this book, and the first essay, there's 2 essays in here. The first essay is Mundus Imaginalis, and it's a pretty heady philosophical, metaphysical essay. But the one that really hooked me was his second essay, which is the longer of the 2, called Comparative Spiritual Hermeneutics. And as many of you know who have watched my past videos, I became a huge hermeneutic geek. I was, in my videos, when I was defending Islam or attacking Christianity or whatever, I was constantly talking about interpretation. Because I think it's a very important topic. I still believe this. Very, very important to understand the various ways in which a text, regardless of whether it's considered scripture or not, is interpreted and understood by readers throughout the centuries. And so Henry Corbin in this essay was really speaking my language. And he was comparing Shia esoteric interpretations of the Qur'an with Swedenborg's interpretation of the Bible. And I was reading this, and my mind was just blown. First off, I was really glad to see that there was this rich esoteric tradition within Shia Islam. I was familiar with Sufi interpretations of the Qur'an, but I really appreciated that comparison. But the thing that, at this point, this is like the crossroads here, right? It's like I can either, who knows? Maybe if I had been tickled or inspired in a different way, maybe I would have started heading towards Shia Islam. Maybe in a parallel dimension, I did that. and I converted or reconverted or whatever to Islam as a Shia. But I didn't. When I finished this book, I was like, okay, fine, I'll read this guy Swedenborg. And so what I did is I picked up a few more books, and I have them here. The first one was the next one was Swedenborg, Buddha of the North by D.T. Suzuki. Again, I was familiar with D.T. Suzuki. I owned and read his books on Zen Buddhism. And I read this book, and once again, was very inspired. I was inspired to see that there was a theme here, that there were people from various religious traditions who were able to compare Swedenborg to these other traditions, and there was no contradiction. And I really liked that, and so that's what D.T. Suzuki's book, did for me. The next book that I read, and so if you notice, I didn't jump into Swedenborg's primary text right away. The next book that I read was called The Presence of Other Worlds by Wilson Van Dusen. Now, Van Dusen was an American clinical psychologist who was an expert in treating patients with schizophrenia and other severe pathologies. And he, besides being a clinical psychologist, and studying the psychology of religion, he also studied comparative religion as well, comparative mysticism, and he was a huge fan of Emanuel Swedenborg. And so I read this book, and this really spoke to me because I majored in psychology. Let's see, at this time I wasn't in my master's in counseling program yet, but no, in fact, I had just graduated thereabouts with my bachelor's in psychology. And so this, again, really spoke to me. And so then I started to do all this other research, and I began to discover that tons of famous people had read Swedenborg throughout history. Emerson, Thoreau, Carl Jung, and I had read Memories, Dreams, Reflections. Jung references Swedenborg in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and the list goes on and on. William Blake, and so these are all people that I highly respected and found that Swedenborg was so influential on these individuals and their thought process. Even if these people didn't say that they were Swedenborgians, they were certainly inspired by Swedenborgian theology and Swedenborg's writings. So I was really inspired by reading Wilson Van Dusen, because this was a psychological interpretation on Swedenborg. So this is something that's a preface for the remainder of this video, because I do consider myself a Swedenborgian, amongst other things, but I do go back and forth between a psychological interpretation of his writings, and then I do peer into it from a metaphysical perspective as well. And maybe I'll do a separate video on that. Okay, so then the first book that I actually read by Swedenborg was Heaven and Hell. This is probably his most popular book. This was the first copy. I have multiple copies and translations of the text. This is the one that I picked up from a used bookstore and read it and was blown away by it. Was totally blown away by it, because what I discovered by reading Swedenborg and reading this book was a view of the afterlife that really appealed to me. Now, I want to be very clear. I'm still rather agnostic about the details regarding life after death in most metaphysical topics. So I'm not saying like I read this and I was like, oh yeah, 100%. This is how it's going to be, guys, when we die. But I am, I feel very certain that consciousness does continue on after death, or I'm not opposed to the idea of that. Having done a lot of readings on near-death experiences and, research on, people's experiences with almost dying. And so I'm open to the possibility. But this view of the afterlife, Swedenborg's view of the afterlife, really captivated me. And I was, just totally became a fan of it, of his writings at this point. And so the next thing is I started to attend a Swedenborgian church, and then decided to join. I became a Swedenborgian, and then the two books that I read pretty much when I started going to church was this book by Gary Lockman called Swedenborg, an introduction to his life and ideas. Very short book. I highly recommend this if you just want to get a brief overview of his life. And I read this, and I absolutely loved it. I loved it because his life fascinated me, and I began to really accept that he had these experiences, these spiritual experiences that informed the vast majority of the corpus of his writings. The other book that I read was by Reverend Wilma Wake, which is called Crystals, Crosses, and Chakras, which is a memoir on her spiritual journey. Which ends with her becoming a Swedenborgian and then becoming a Swedenborgian minister. And so this was cool because I was able to read this and sort of get someone else's journey and what appealed to them about Swedenborg. And so, and then as many of you know, I'm a huge bibliophile. And so what I'll do is I'll turn the camera here, and if you can see that bookcase with sort of the green hardcover on the top there, not the bookcase that's totally in the corner, but the one right there, that brown one there, that is all my Swedenborg books, and that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 shelves, and it's wide enough where I can have books in front of other books. So rest assured, there are books behind the books you can clearly see up front there, and I'm not just showing that off, just be like, ooh, if you've been watching my videos for a few years now, I'm a book freak. But like any subject that I dive into, I immerse myself into it. And so I acquired these books slowly. We're talking, the end of 2012. It was around that point when I started attending a Swedenborgian church. And so from the end of 2012 to now, I've been slowly acquiring these texts on Swedenborg and Swedenborgian theology. And so, so that's pretty much what got me there. And then the next logical question that people might ask me is why? What was it about Swedenborg and Swedenborgian theology? And I think for me, what it was a few things. His theology just makes sense rationally. There were a lot of things that I did not like about traditional Abrahamic religion. I did not like the fact that most forms of Abrahamic religions are very narrow in terms of saying it's our way or the highway. And even when I was a Muslim, I definitely gravitated towards the text in the Qur'an that appeared to be very pluralistic. And I gravitated towards scholars who had a very pluralistic attitude. I don't think, even at my height of my orthodoxy, I never believed that Islam was the only religion that was right for humanity. So I never became a narrow, exclusive person. I think I was always inclusive, and I was a pretty staunch pluralist, even at the height of my Sunni orthodoxy experiences. And so what I like about Swedenborg is that pluralism is built into his theology. Everyone has a chance to go to heaven and hell. It doesn't really matter what religion you follow. Now, obviously, he had a bias towards Christianity because he himself was a Christian. But it's clear in his theology in numerous places that he has a view of religion and faith that is pluralistic in nature. That essentially, if you are a spiritual person and you lead a good life, you're good. That's really it. Everything else is just details. It's really important how you live your life. How do these spiritual ideas that are playing a role in your mind and in your heart, how do those things play out in your everyday life? And so he really, really emphasizes that, and I really liked that. So you got the universalism, or at least the pluralism. Speaking of heaven and hell, and speaking of the book, again, my hang-ups about the Abrahamic traditional view of heaven and hell, I was getting sick of it. The idea of a day of judgment, typically a literal second coming. The idea that a wrathful God is going to either send people to heaven and then punish people in hell for all eternity. Absolutely disgusted with this theological notion. And Swedenborg doesn't teach that. In fact, God for Swedenborg is God is incapable of feeling anger or wrath towards creation. And so, and in fact, there's no predestination. There is free will, and we participate in either packing our bags for the next life, either going to one destination or the other. So that really appealed to me. So in a lot of ways, what Swedenborg has done for me is Swedenborg has rehabilitated Christianity for me. I, really had a lot of hang-ups with Orthodox Christianity, and in terms of the Trinity and how to read the Bible, and Swedenborg has rehabilitated that for me. His ideas about God make a lot of sense to me. God is one person, one being, and this thing called the Trinity is just different manifestations of the divine. And his approach to the Bible, again, very much appreciated it because the literal reading is the lowest form. It's regulated as being possible historical stories, but probably psychological, and definitely the highest form of reading it is to try and understand the divine by reading the text and also our spiritual growth. Those are considered to be the higher levels. There's 3 levels of understanding Scripture. The literal is the lowest. And so I was totally down with that because even before reading Swedenborg, I was fascinated by reading the works of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell, which I had mentioned many times in my past videos, and looking at the text non-literally but as a psychological narrative or a psychological symbolism was certainly something I was already versed in, and it was nice to now be reading a theologian who was speaking the same language, talking about the same way of reading the text. So, yeah, these are things that, and I think the big thing, really, is the emphasis on experience. I learned this by reading Swedenborg's biography, and also reading Wilma Wake's memoir, which was essentially Swedenborgians, and Swedenborg encourages spiritual experience. You are not required to accept Swedenborg's ideas as dogma or doctrine. Now, I want to be clear. Early Swedenborgians, when there was a actual church movement that began, which Swedenborg did not start himself. You would see a lot of, especially British Swedenborgians and early American Swedenborgians, writing about doctrine. Okay, and Swedenborg himself talks about doctrine here and there. But modern 21st century, at least in the branch that I belong to, which is the Swedenborgian Church of North America, does not have a huge emphasis on dogma, creed, or conforming. It's a very diverse group, and you're encouraged to view Swedenborg's writings from your own perspective. The only thing that everyone agrees on is that we feel inspired by Swedenborg's writings, and we come together as a community. About it. Besides that, everything else is up for conversation. But yeah, I'm huge about understanding and studying and experiencing for myself spiritual reality. And I feel that Swedenborg is encouraging folks to read his works and consider them for themselves instead of saying, hey, I saw all this stuff, so you better believe. There really isn't that type of argument that occurs in his writings. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I feel like that might be all I have to really say. I guess the only thing else that I'll say is that, like I said, I'm not just a Swedenborgian now. I belong to other spiritual and esoteric groups. And I feel that Swedenborg, that's another thing about Swedenborg that's awesome, is that you can look at Swedenborg from a long tradition of historical Christianity. But because his emphasis that the older denominations are dying out, which they are, and that really there's going to be this new church or this new era of spiritual growth, he's sort of in the middle of what is like new religious movements, like esoteric, late 1800, early 1900 spiritual groups. People might say the New Age, and then also in the context of historical theology. So he's sort of right at the center there. He's definitely the bridge between the two. And when you start studying the history of religion leading up to this point in Europe and America, you see that there is this natural bridge between Swedenborg and spiritual esoteric writers that come after him, like Rudolf Steiner, Blavatsky, Gurdjieff, Aleister Crowley, people like that. So, yeah, I feel like Swedenborg certainly has inspired me to look even past him, see more current spiritual writers and what they are saying. But yeah, I think that's it. So if anybody has any other questions, or if you feel like I didn't touch on something, specific, that you have questions, feel free to comment in the comment section below. I appreciate the feedback. Again, please check out my blog and my Twitter account if you want to follow me on Twitter and on WordPress. That's awesome. Hope you enjoyed this. Thank you all for watching. Peace be with you all. Love is the law. Love under will.